Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Naomi Schaefer Riley, and I'm a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. My research here focuses on child welfare, the foster care system, and education. Along with my colleague Ian Rowe, who focuses on education, upward mobility, and adoption, we'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's event. Just so you know, Ian and I actually have a podcast, a bi-weekly one that's called Are You Kidding Me? Which examines systems and programs that purport to help children, but often do not. And you can check it out wherever you get your podcasts. So with that out of the way, I'd like to tell you about today's event. We are beyond pleased to be hosting distinguished researchers Jay Belsky and Terrie Moffitt to discuss their new book, The Origins of You, How Childhood Shapes Later Life. We all know that our experiences during our early years have a deep impact on what happens later. But how? A few months ago, I was interviewing a very successful economist. When he tells people that he grew up in an orphanage, they often marvel at the way that he turned out despite his upbringing. No, he corrects them, he turned out this way because of his upbringing. So many of our public policies rest on this question of how our childhood impacts the rest of our lives. Should we have universal daycare? What should our schools teach? How much should we encourage marriage? How can we teach parents about taking care of babies? How important is it for kids to stay away from drugs? Should we take different approaches to raising boys and girls? When does a child need protection from their parents? Do adverse childhood experiences mitigate adults' responsibilities for their actions? The Origins of You provides so much food for thought on dozens of fascinating topics, and I cannot recommend it to you enough. But today we have asked Mr. Belsky and Ms. Moffitt to focus on 3 areas in particular, with the possibility of addressing the 4th if we have some time. The 3 are daycare, self-control, and fathers. We might get to cannabis if you guys are lucky. Ian and I take full responsibility for picking these topics, and any abruptness in the transition from one to the other is entirely our fault. After about 20 minutes, we will then have a discussion of some of these issues with the authors and open it up to questions from the audience. So with that, let me introduce our 2 guests. Jay Belsky is the Robert M. and Natalie Reed Dorn Professor of Human Development at the University of California, Davis. And Terrie Moffitt is the Nanurl O. Keohane University Distinguished Professor at Duke University. So you know, when we open it up for questions, we'll be taking questions through 2 ways. One is via Twitter at hashtag Origins of You, and the other is through email to my colleague Celine. Her email is Celine, CELINE.Bookin, BOOKIN, at AEI.org. So with that, let me turn it over to our distinguished guests.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about the effects of daycare, and toward that end, I'm going to draw on a 10-site study called the NICHD, Study of Early Childcare and Youth Development, that was launched, in the midst of a controversy which some people refer to as the daycare wars back in the early 1990s. At that time, the mantra was, at least among progressives, that if the quality of care is good, then everything's okay. Nothing to worry about. It takes care of everything. And by quality, they meant how attentive, responsive, stimulating, and affectionate caregivers were to their children. Let me be clear here. I'm not talking exclusively about center-based care. I'm talking about all varieties of non-family care. And so in the midst of this controversy, the NICHD launched what became a 10-site study following more than 1,300 children. Initially, the plan was to 3 years of age, but we took the kids till 15 years of age. The moral of the story in a nutshell is that the effects of daycare are at least somewhat complex. As long thought, we did discover that quality counts. The more attentive, responsive, stimulating caregivers were across the first 4.5 years of life, the more cognitively and linguistically skilled children were before they started school, the first year of kindergarten, and they had somewhat greater academic achievement by adolescence, age 15. But it was also the case that the more time children spent in care, meaning hours, weeks, months, years, from 3 months of age all the way to 4.5 years of age, the more behavior problems they manifest. And that was irrespective of the quality of care, whether it was good, bad, or indifferent. So it wasn't a simple story, as people argued back in the early 90s, and many still do. It's quality stupid. It was that we have different features of childcare that have different effects. Now, let me qualify what I've said in a very important way. The effects were rather small to modest. I couldn't go into a classroom and identify with my naked eye which kids had which childcare experiences. Having said that, though, we should appreciate that the norm in this country today is for children to start childcare of some kind in the first year of life, typically in the first 6 months of life. So what I call early in the first year of life, extensive, more than 20 to 30 hours per week, continuous until they start school, is basically the American norm these days. Now, what was also important to discover was that families matter more than childcare. They had bigger effects. And that, talking here about the quality of parenting, how organized the household was, whether parents' mental health, but we can't necessarily presume that that's all environmentally driven, because of course families pass on genes to their children. So the bottom line was that we shouldn't overinterpret effects of daycare, but we shouldn't ignore them either. But we should certainly get beyond the notion that the only thing that matters is quality. And we should remember that we reside in a society without really much of a child care policy organized, and that children in America start child care of some manner, shape, or form beginning very early in the first year of life here in the 21st century. Okay? I've covered what I wanted to cover.
And that was too fast. Okay, everyone take a deep breath, clear your mind. We'll talk about a completely different topic. Okay, I've been asked to tell you all for about 10 minutes about the research that we introduced in chapter 3 of The Origins of You, and it's on early childhood self-control. So thanks very much for Ian and Naomi for inviting me to do this. I wanted just to begin by asking, explaining to you why I studied self-control in the first place. So the backstory to this project is that I met economist James Heckman, who's from the University of Chicago, at a scientific meeting. And he had just published his follow-up of children who attended the Perry Preschool Project, Head Start Project program in the 1960s. Head Start was designed to help kids by raising their IQs, you will remember, but it famously had not achieved that. And nevertheless, the Perry Preschool kids had surprisingly better outcomes than their control group when they were followed up as adults. So Heckman was scratching his head and musing that Head Start obviously had improved something about these kids, but what? What was it? He called it non-cognitive skills, and by that he meant simply something other than intelligence. Now, he knew that I had been following 1,000 children born in 1972, growing up in the Dunedin longitudinal study for 4 decades. And so he tried to talk me into analyzing whether a child's level of self-control, which was non-cognitive, could predict adult outcomes decades later. At the time, this was not known. But he reasoned that if it were true, then the magic ingredient in Head Start might well have been improving children's self-control. So what did I say? I said, nah, no way. Everybody already knows that success in life follows from high intelligence and family socioeconomic advantage. If you take these 2 factors into account, self-control is going to pale by comparison. But Jim Heckman is a Nobel laureate, and so I tested his hypothesis just to humor him along and really to get him to go away. The first thing we needed was a good measure of childhood self-control. So today, self-control is under intense study by many of the branches of behavioral science, and they each use a different concept. So for example, personality psychologists will study conscientiousness. Child psychologists will study delay of gratification using the marshmallow test. Behavioral economists will study intertemporal choice, reward discounting, things like that. Neuroscientists study the brain's executive functions. And even management science studies willpower and self-discipline. But remember that the Dunedin study members were little kids back in the 1970s. And so we had to dig back into the data set to find out what information we had that would fit these same concepts. So we measured each child's self-control during the first decade of their lives by assessing the following sorts of qualities. Impulsive, acts without thinking, can't wait his turn, low frustration tolerance, she dislikes effortful tasks, has a fleeting attention, easily forgets goals, lacks persistence, often goes for the most risky, enticing thing, and requires constant attention and motivation from adults. Now, these questions were among the hundreds of questions on checklists that had been used by the study to assess each study child's behavior during the 1970s. And the checklists were given when the children were 3, 5, 7, 9, and 11 years old. They were filled in by their mothers at each of those ages and by the staff of the research unit and by 4 different teachers at preschool, 2nd grade, 4th grade, and 5th grade. And then when the children turned 11, they were allowed to report on their own self-control. Now, you will know, of course, that small children haven't got much self-control, and that is developmentally typical and normal. It doesn't signify anything. Every child shows poor self-control at some point. They have a bad day, they don't feel well, but this is temporary. So when I speak here today of poor self-control, I don't mean just a single instance of it. I mean that we use the data to measure each child's pattern of self-control across 10 years at home, at school, in the clinic, and reported by multiple different people. So this was a major improvement on past research on self-control. Now, our next step was to fast forward 30 years into adulthood and measure the outcomes that would reflect a successful life. And it's important to keep in mind here that by 2019, last April, 95% of the original sample of 1,000 children were still taking part in this study. And this means that the children who've had an unsuccessful life have not dropped out selectively. So the findings today do represent the population, at least of New Zealand. So there are lots of different Dunedin study findings about self-control. And what I want to do is just hit a very few high points. So I'm going to start with health. Well, we counted up whether the study members as adults had clinically abnormal conditions like metabolic abnormalities, diabetes, obesity, periodontal disease, sexually transmitted diseases, respiratory conditions, things like that. And what we found was a gradient. The poorer a child's self-control had been before age 11, the more health problems they had 30 years later. And this was along a dimension. Then I'll just draw it across the screen. Okay, so all along the dimension of self-control, you had more and more and more health problems, the less self-control the child had. Then we looked at aging. We measured each study member's biological age profile by using a panel of 19 biomarkers. And we did this when they turned age 45. The children with the lowest self-control are by now biologically older. Their average biological age is 46. And the children with the highest self-control are staying young. Their average biological age is 44. So they're already 2 years apart. They look older too. We took digital photographs of their faces last year, and these were rated by American undergraduates who did not know the person's real age. The undergraduate students guessed ages anywhere between 32 and 65, but the children who had had the best self-control now still look youngest when they're in their 40s. So let's think about their wealth. This is, after all, the Enterprise Institute, right? So children with poor self-control were earning less money in midlife than their more self-controlled peers. Their adult occupations were less prestigious and required less education and less skill. And they were less oriented towards saving money. and they had accrued fewer assets. We looked at their credit ratings with their permission. The children with low self-control, when they grew up to midlife, had the lowest average credit ratings. They're going to have difficulty not only borrowing money to buy a house or start a business, but credit ratings affect the price of your life insurance, your health and auto insurance, and even your ability to get a mobile phone contract in New Zealand. We also studied their comprehension of complex financial concepts. So we did open-ended qualitative interviews with each of these 1,000 people last year. And we asked them things like, what's the advantage of paying off your credit card balance every month? Why do some people spread investments and savings across different types of schemes? And what is the advantage to starting to save for retirement when you're still young? What we found is the 45-year-olds who had the poorest self-control when they were a child most often gave incorrect answers muddled up to these questions, showing that they didn't really understand. We asked about the cost to their government of self-control problems. We looked at government records of social welfare benefits that had been used by our study members across the 45 years of their lives. We found on average the Dunedin children who had the poorest self-control were likely to be supported by government social welfare benefits for 4 years or more. But those with the best self-control had often used benefits but got off them in under a year. And then we ask about parenting the next generation. So this is work that Jay has done. When each study member has a child that's 3 years old, a team goes out and visits the home and does an assessment. They take videotapes of structured parent-child interactions. These come back to the United States and are scored by parenting and parent-child interaction experts. And they score for the different aspects of the quality of parenting by the study members. What we learned is, once again, there was a gradient. The children who had people who had less self-control as children had grown up to be poorer quality parents for their own child when they reached adulthood. They were less warm to their child and less sensitive to their child's needs. Now, you're probably by now saying to yourself, just a minute here, I bet the reason that poor self-control seems to make such a big difference is because children with poor self-control tend to come from the poorest homes, or maybe they have low intelligence, or maybe they're all boys, or they probably have diagnosed ADHD. And that's what I expected too. These are great explanations, but they didn't explain the predictive power of self-control. The self-control gradient stayed the same when we looked at the children from high-income families only, children with above average IQ only, girls only, and when we reanalyzed all the data excluding the children who had a diagnosis of ADHD. Okay, so near the end, how did self-control become so important as intelligence and socioeconomic status, at least for children born since the 1970s. And the thinking here is that perhaps it's because self-control is more necessary now than ever before in human history. Historians, my colleagues who are historians, tell me that we need our self-control to avoid becoming obese, because we live in an era of ready food availability. We need self-discipline to maintain our physical fitness because all jobs are sedentary. We need our self-control to sustain our marriages and keep them together because it's easier now to get a divorce than ever before. We need self-control to prevent addiction because of an era of easy access to addictive substances. We need self-control to resist overspending because we live in an era of sophisticated internet marketing that's targeted personally to us. And we need self-discipline to save for old age because we're now in an era with no guaranteed pensions. So now we know that self-control is important, and the question is, what next? I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Moffitt, and thank you, Dr. Belsky. And thank you really for the gift that is the book, The Origins of You. As someone who actually runs schools in elementary and middle school, there's so many insights that are helpful in choosing how we work with our students. I mean, one of the very earliest lines you say in the book is that human development is not subject to ironclad laws, but instead is a matter of possibilities and probabilities, multiple forces that together determine the direction a life will take. And it's remarkable to have 4 decades worth of data to show what kinds of experiences then correlate or cause adult behavior. And so one of the things we want to definitely talk about in this conversation are what are the policies or what are the interventions that help to create the conditions so that more kids can develop habits of self-control much earlier in their life. But before we actually go there, Naomi mentioned that there were 3 areas that we wanted you to focus on. And so I thought it would be helpful because part of your research did identify a particular set of outcomes related to the presence or non-presence of fathers in the home. So can you take back some of your time to just tell us a little bit about the research that was uncovered as it related to father-absent homes?
Okay, I'll pick up that. And actually, this is exactly where my relationship with Terrie began. The role of fathers in children's development, has been thought about and studied since the time of Freud. Freud argued that it was in this Oedipal conflict process that boys developed their moral sensibility. I'm not going to get into those details. And so they developed a large literature from the 1940s forward, testing this idea and discovering that boys without fathers often seem to have, poorer moral orientation. And there was even evidence that the same seemed in some ways to be related to females, in particular, early onset of sexual activity, more promiscuous sexual activity. And so most of this kind of evidence was discussed in kind of a traditional psychological or psychoanalytic perspective of just bad character development. Well, along came a pair of anthropologists who reinterpreted this work from an evolutionary perspective and basically said that the absence of a father signals risk to a developing child. And what's most important to living things is the passing on of genes to future generations. And so the theory, they reinterpreted the evidence to say, in the absence of a father, the child is learning that there's risk, that he may be less or she may be less safe in the world, and therefore they might not even survive to reproduce. So this accelerates sexual behavior at the cost of good quality care of children, because if you're at risk in the future, maybe you need more kids for some of them to survive because you can't protect them as well. I found this most intriguing, but it was just a reinterpretation of findings. So I spent some time scratching my head and saying, if this is true, what would be a surprising prediction that could distinguish this view of development, an evolutionary one, if you would, from a traditional character perspective and psychological one? And I came up with the idea that it would be pubertal development. That boys growing up, the children growing up in father-absent families and under other stressful conditions would mature sexually earlier, because in the face of the anticipated risk to them, getting to reproduction sooner would be important, because evolution privileges the passing on of genes more than it privileges health, wealth, and happiness. Well, I ran into Terrie in a bar in a hotel with her then fiance and my good friend and her husband now, Avshalom Kaspi, in, of all places, northern Finland. And I interrupted a conversation they were having about puberty in my New York impudent style. And I said, I've got a hypothesis for you. And I said, my prediction is that children growing up without fathers and under other stressful conditions will sexually mature earlier. Now, when I had posed this to many other people, they rejected it. They don't like the idea of evolutionary thinking. They thought it was nuts. They didn't want to go there. But what did my good friend now, many years later, Terrie, say? She didn't say anything like that. She said, we can test that, because she's an empirically minded scientist. I fell in love with her right then. And we went out and tested it. And lo and behold, at least in the case of girls, this is what we found. And ever since, there's been more and more evidence that father absence and other stressful conditions accelerates children's sexual development, that they mature somewhat earlier. They engage in sex, as we've long known, somewhat earlier. They're more indiscriminate in their sexuality than others. They go on to have even more children who they care for more poorly. From an evolutionary perspective, this all makes sense, that this isn't a matter of simply immorality and fallen character. When organisms feel threatened and their future is precarious, they have to hurry up to develop. Maybe lacking self-control is part of that process. They will physically mature earlier. They will engage in sexual behavior sooner and under less intimate and devoted conditions. They will do it with more people, and they will have more kids who they would take less care of. Why? Because they don't really have the resources and the capabilities to care for them. And maybe they need 4, 5, or 6 kids to have 2, 3 grandchildren, where children growing up under safe and secure conditions can wait to grow up. They can embody educational, psychological, nutritional resources. They can wait for better mates. They can mature later. They can plan. To get those same 4 grandchildren, they only need 2 children. So the idea here is that when we see individuals growing up under conditions of adversity, including many cases of father absence, what is often regarded as poor character or poor behavior is actually biologically strategic. It may no longer pay off in modern society, but we human beings have evolved to function this way. And that doesn't mean we can't do anything about it, but it may mean that as long as we're raising children under conditions that lack safety and security, we shouldn't be surprised that they don't develop in the ways we'd like them to, because there are biological tendencies to say, if the world is risky, hurry up to mature, hurry up to mate, hurry up to have kids, because you'll either be compromised or you may be dead before you get the chance. And to repeat, evolution privileges reproduction over long-term health and happiness.
That's a very powerful, thank you. I don't think I've ever heard the term biologically strategic applied to situations in which kids are missing their fathers. So let's get into questions. And let me say that for any of the audience that has questions, please send your questions either to #OrigInsOfYou, or send an email to our great Celine.Buchan, which is spelled CELINE .Buchan, BOOKIN @aei.org. So let's first question, let's hone in on the first component that you spoke about, Dr. Belsky, the impact of daycare. I'm intrigued that you said the quality of daycare certainly matters, but over time, it sounds like the duration, actually you have diminishing returns. You created a linkage between greater duration of daycare and behavioral problems later in life. What's interesting about that is that I ran a network of schools, elementary and middle, starting in kindergarten. And when we got our 5-year-olds, when kids were formally starting schooling, we saw a whole host of issues in terms of academic development, social development. So we started pre-K to get them at 4 years old. And even then we started issues, but instead of more center-based care, we started a parent-child home visiting program where the younger siblings of our current scholars, starting at 18 months old, would get 2 visits per week over a 2-year period to help build the capacity of parents to build a stronger environment. What do you think of those kinds of ideas, and why do you think it is the duration of daycare, even if it's high quality, can have this more adverse impact later in life?
Okay, let me just be clear. When I talk about duration, I'm really talking about starting in the first year of life and then continuing through the start till the start of school, because I've been part of a piece of lovely work in Norway where virtually there's no daycare of any kind through the first year of life. And come 1 year of age, all kids go into daycare. It's high quality, the caregivers are well educated, and they're well paid, something that doesn't describe daycare in America at all. And you don't see the kind of problems that we pick up in the USA, suggesting that the policy context is very important. Now, to address your question, why is it that lots of time in care starting in infancy and continuing through the start of school has these untoward behavioral effects, which could be framed as lack of self-control, to use Terrie's and the economist Heckman's terminology, remains a mystery. In fact, it's open season on hypotheses. We actually thought it might have something to do with the increased risk of insecure attachment of babies to their mothers. That didn't work out as the explanatory factor. We thought it might have to do with the fact that when kids were away from their parents for a long period of time, the parents were less sensitive and responsive, and that would be the mechanism which influenced these problem behavior. That didn't work out. What other people have thought about it as being having to do with just the stress of separation, and especially physiologically and elevated cortisol levels. We weren't in position to evaluate that. So it remains somewhat of a mystery. What did turn out a little bit in our evidence was that it was when kids were in centers that had lots of kids and they had more kids than pediatric advisories would suggest should be in a group together. So they were in large groups. And the truth be told, almost every single kid in every single center was in a group that was bigger than what the pediatricians advised in the American Pediatric Association. So there was some indication it had to do with being with lots of kids in large groups. That didn't explain it all, but it explains some of it. So it may be that, what happens is a few bad apples become contagious, and kids have to keep up with the Joneses. If they're getting pushed around, they have to push back. And in fact, there's some lovely new data, lovely may be the wrong word, out of Canada showing exactly this, that kids who start in school without extensive childcare histories and start with lower levels of aggression and disobedience than kids who have long childcare histories, well, they become like the kids with long childcare histories. There's almost, you might argue, there's a kind of behavioral infection. And again, it might be keeping up with the Joneses. So what's so fascinating here is that the behavior problems that may develop modestly from this long history of childcare actually spreads to other kids, like an infection spreads. I'm putting infection in parentheses here. I don't want to be hyperbolic about it, but we've seen this in at least 2 large studies going on.
The higher cortisol levels that I think have been found in a couple of studies now among children in daycare settings seem like they'd be compatible with your hypothesis about large groups. I mean, that maybe that is a source of stress for kids.
Well, I think the word you used was absolutely perfect, Naomi. Compatible with. We weren't in a position to test that particular proposition. So I would just distinguish a hypothesis as you've just advanced it and a plausible interpretation, but not turn it into an established fact.
Right.
And before we leave the topic of daycare, you say in Norway, the big difference is that the first year of life, there's much less implementation of daycare for kids. What's happening in that first year that you think is making the difference?
Well, it's not just as much less, there's virtually none. That there's family support, is paid parental leave through a whole year. And the truth of the matter is, and this is rarely popularized, when surveys are done in America, and when I worked in England, they were done in England too, I saw, you ask parents what their preferences are. Their preferences are to be home with their babies. It's not that both parents or the single parent doesn't want to be employed. They don't want to be economically coerced into the marketplace of employment by the time the child's 3 months of age. And that's where we are in the United States for the most part. So if you look at rates of maternal employment, for example, of kids 5, 6, and 7, and rates of maternal employment for kids who are 6 months old, they're virtually the same. Because if you're going to go back to work after you have a baby, you're going to do it right off the bat because there's no alternative. So what the Norwegians do is they economically support families during that first year of life. They enable families to get their lives together through the adjustment to having a baby. They allow relationships to form. And then most important, just as importantly, kids are not going into a helter-skelter childcare system, which parents have to navigate, not knowing what's going on, but communities have well-funded, well-functioning childcare centers where caregivers are well-trained and tolerably well-paid. You know, one of the real crimes, I would say, in this country is when people are forced to pay other people minimum wages to take care of their children, especially when that's not their preference, but they don't have any other economic alternative.
One of the things that you talk about is this idea of the intergenerational transmission of parenting. And maybe Dr. Moffitt, you can take this question. What does that actually mean? Because it sounds like some of the studies that you showed that how a child is treated, even at 3 years old, has deep implications for how they parent many years later. Just talk about that.
Okay. I think that people do what our research and other people's research shows that there is continuity between how a child was parented when they were very young and then how they in turn treat their own child when they grow up and have their own children. Jay's been the leader on this research in the Dunedin study, and so he can give us a little bit more detail. But I can just describe from what I have found is that in our study of 11,000 twin pairs growing up in the UK, these children were all born in 1994, and we've been following them the way that we've been following the cohort born in Dunedin, New Zealand. In the UK families, we measured the children's exposure to the domestic violence and conflict between their mother and her partners. And what we have found now that we have followed those children into their 20s is that those who grew up with domestic violence have it themselves now in their own relationships in their 20s. And so they'll be exposing their children to it. So there is some kind of continuity going on there. On the other hand, one of the themes in our book is how modest these predictive effects are of continuity. So over and over, when we're talking about predicting from IQ, from social class, from self-control, from father absence, from any of the things that happen in early life to how a person's living their life in midlife, the excitement to us is that there's any kind of continuity at all. And so we usually write up papers in the scientific literature saying, wow, look at this. There's real prediction from childhood to adulthood. But on the other hand, the prediction is never deterministic in any way, and it's always modest. So there have got to be plenty of kids who grow up exposed to domestic violence who make the decision that that's not going to be how they live their lives and how they expose their children. This is something that the research has not got a good handle on, is this kind of individual agency and decision-making to live life a different way than what you grew up with. I think it's a fantastic topic area, and I really want to get into it, but I don't have hard, cold data on that at the moment.
I would just qualify a little bit of what Terrie just said. First of all, I would agree with her that prediction from early childhood to later adulthood shouldn't be exaggerated. And what we should always keep in mind is that development, as we emphasize in the book, is continuous. So what happens in middle childhood, what happens in adolescence, what even happens in young adulthood can sustain what happened earlier or can deflect and correct a problematical or even a good developmental trajectory. So Development doesn't end in the first year or the first 5 years of life. And in fact, in our parenting work, what we found was that the quality of parenting that a child experienced in preschool and in middle childhood and in adolescence all contributed to the prediction of how they parented their child at age 3, their child when they were adults and parenting 3-year-olds. So it's not just how you're parenting, how you were parented in the preschool years.
In
But I
terms
would
of
say
the,
they're
I just wanted
actually
to ask, so in terms of the outcomes, I mean, if you had to sort of put your finger on one of those 3 things as the most predictive, would you be willing to say that one of the stages of childhood is the most predictive of outcomes in the future?
You know, the posing that question in some ways is statistically you can examine it, but a critique might be that it's ecologically invalid. Nobody goes from being a preschooler to being an adult without crossing the bridge of middle childhood and adolescence. So there's plenty of theory that would suggest that earlier matters more. I actually have some different thoughts on that. I don't want to go to them right now. If we have time, maybe I could, but I just want to point out that I would say this, and I think this may be where you're going, Naomi. Starting earlier to support families and child well-being makes a lot more sense than starting later. Because as Temmie's work on adolescents who are delinquents and have engaged in a lot of serious problem behavior shows that once trajectories get started, they risk being crystallized. And once they get crystallized in a bad way, they're ever harder to redirect. So prevention, as we all know, is a lot more effective than providing cures, a lot more efficient.
One of the public policy implications in my work on child welfare is, for instance, the question of how long a child should be able to remain in a foster care situation while they're either waiting to be reunified with parents or put into a permanent adoptive home. And there are people who think that, you know, there should be different timelines for kids depending on the age of the child. Right now, we have kind of a uniform law that covers all children, regardless of whether they're, you know, 12 or 8 or 0. And so just thinking about, the implications of early childhood development versus later childhood development is something that comes up a lot. But
yeah, attachment theory would suggest that the early is the key thing. And I have heard many pediatricians say that if a child is, has been neglected in the first 2 or 3 years of life, that they're permanently damaged and there'll be no recovering from that. I don't think that that's really in keeping with the modest level of prediction in the literature from even the most kind of neglectful situations. The exception to that would be when we look at findings from the studies that have been done in the United States and the UK of Romanian adoptees. And those, the amount of time spent in the orphanage does seem to make a huge difference. But in the studies that I do, where they're just ordinary families representing the general population living in the community, we don't see a very strong specific period effect for what the age of the child.
So if you were advising the new administration, or whichever administration will be taking over on in January, what would be the policy implications that you would be most championing? If we know, for example, absent fathers have this long-term impact, should we, as Naomi described at the very outset, should promoting marriage be something that should be done, given that especially if it's fathers who are not engaged in antisocial behavior? So what are the kinds of implications that you would be most championing, given that there are these different intervention points?
Well, I mean, I'll just say very quickly that I think, as I've already implied, is as a general rule, earlier is better, but don't reify it to the point where later doesn't matter. But I would say money matters. We've got all sorts of programs to correct for the adverse effects of poverty. Poor people are more likely to be depressed. Poor people are more likely to neglect their children. Poor people are more likely to be stressed and have trouble being sensitive and supportive. There's something to be said for a child allowance, for a minimum family income, to enable families to take care of themselves, especially if it's guaranteed over the long term, so they know they have a stake in the future. And so I think all these programs, be it supporting marriage or fostering sensitive parenting or providing good quality childcare, are good things, but they shouldn't distract us from the fact that if families don't have basic resources to take care of themselves and their children, these are band-aids on wounds that keep occurring. Most families, except with rare exception, care an awful lot for their children, as much as do better resourced families. Yet for some reason, we're prepared to spend lots of money on interventions rather than actually direct economic support. So I think that should be part of the agenda myself. And in fact, there's new research going on as we speak by a guy named Greg Duncan at the University of California at Irvine, seeking to test this hypothesis that just giving money to families will have beneficial effects to children's well-being. I think it will myself. I think if you look at social welfare countries around the world would have better safety nets, you see the indirect evidence of this. So that's what I would say. How about you, Terrie?
Gee.
We actually have some questions from the audience.
Too, let's cut to the question.
You don't mind me saving.
Just for your knowledge, this is where Jay and I differ in our politics. I'm much more libertarian, so if we had quarrels late at night drinking wine, this would be over this, how much we should intervene in the lives of families.
Okay. So Ian, do you want to tell some of the questions we have from the audience?
So we have one question, Dr. Moffitt, focused on self-control. Does your self-control measurement have higher or lower predictive power than other factors that you mentioned, like intelligence, parent quality, or parent marriage status? Is self-control the biggest factor?
Yes, that's a great question. So most of the comparisons that I have made statistically are between measures of self-control taken from age 3 to 11, measures of IQ tests given from age 3 to 11 repeatedly, so that the IQ measure is just as strong as the self-control measure, and then measures of the family's socioeconomic status taken from age 3 to 11 repeatedly, both parents' occupations, education, income. So we build really strong measurement models for all three of these concepts, and then deliberately pit them against each other to see which predicts best. Now, they all predict around about the same. I would say that self-control is holding in there longer term. So they were neck and neck as long as the study members were in their teens and their 20s. Now that they're in their 40s, the childhood self-control seems to matter a little bit more for how their lives are turning out, which is really very interesting. They've been able to, overcome their where they started in terms of family socioeconomic status. They've been able to find jobs that suit their level of intelligence and make the most of those. But the self-control is still causing them some problems in midlife. It's also important to keep in mind that one of the reasons why this interest in self-control blossomed about 10 or 15 years ago was because people had got fed up with the idea of trying to improve children's intelligence. That had been tried a lot and spectacularly failed. And people had got fed up with the idea of trying to improve people's socioeconomic status. And so that was fraught with politics and, again, quite difficult to do at a national level. And so there was some kind of a perhaps naive hope that self-control would be easily changed or easily improved, amenable to intervention, whether in a targeted intervention with an individual child or a sort of a blanket universal intervention with, say, a whole state school system. So there has been that favoritism towards focus on self-control.
Yeah. And so we have several questions related to the phenomena of absent fathers. And so several folks are wondering, was the same phenomena seen when there were absent mothers?
That's an excellent question. Unfortunately, there's so much fewer of those that it specifically hasn't been studied. But part of the question here arises from, and there are two views on this. One is that there is something special about the man in the house, and especially that girls have evolved to monitor male investment in their well-being.
Separate from money, right?
Separate from money, although money may affect the quality. That's one view. I hold the view a little differently, given other evidence, that what father absence is in American society is a proxy for all sorts of stressors in the household. Because there's also evidence that marital conflict fosters somewhat earlier puberty, that earthquake in China fosters earlier puberty, so that a variety of conditions that create stress, uncertainty, and perception of risk about tomorrow and my well-being send a message through channels we don't fully understand in the body to hurry up and develop. So from that perspective, if a mother's absence was playing the same kind of role that in American society father's absence often does, then you would expect the same accelerating development effect, if that perspective is on target. If there's something very special about men, then you wouldn't expect it. But to date, we don't have data to sort these two out.
For the rarity of mother absence in our 1,100 families in Britain with twins, we have only 4 in which the mother is absent, and 2 because of the mother's drug abuse, she left the home, and 2 because she died of cancer. And so you can't really study those 2 causes. You can't lump them together, so it makes it intractable to study.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the core research that was done in New Zealand, and you've mentioned Norway and England, is that what are the implications for all of these lessons you've learned in the United States? I mean, one of the things that's fascinating, if you read through Origins of You, there's no mention of race or racism, which I actually think is very powerful because it really it's focused on humanism and human development. What would you say to people who say, well, the issues of race in the United States are so prominent for children that it discounts some of the findings that you have put forth?
Yeah, there's one of the simple answer to why we haven't studied that as a factor, and that is that there was a decision made at the senior funding agencies in the United States to defund longitudinal cohort studies early in my career. And the United States has always lagged behind on this measurement, on this research technology approach. So I went to New Zealand for a reason, because I couldn't really get this work going in the States. And I went to Britain for the same reason. In those countries, the prevalence of brown ethnic minorities, whether Jamaican in Britain or Maori, Polynesian in New Zealand, is under 5% of the samples. So we haven't really been able to single them out for any kind of legitimate comparison. But they also lack the slavery history and lack the current, I would say, lack the current serious history of racial prejudice. There's not to say there's no racial prejudice in New Zealand or the UK. Certainly there is, but it's not like American. What we did at one point, and then I'll shut up, is we partnered with a study in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Youth Study, which was of inner city young people and in the 1990s. And most of those young people were in that study were African American, and we dually tested our hypotheses both in New Zealand and in Britain and in Pittsburgh, and published several papers showing that we would get this effects all in the same direction. Sometimes they were stronger in one country than the other, but they looked pretty much the same qualitatively. We're no longer doing that now.
Can I just add to that? Because, in a class I'm teaching right now, we address this specific issue. And there is good evidence, for example, that if you look at what is mostly a more economic, that if you look at the quality of parenting provided and its effects on children, that they're very similar in South America, in the United States. They're very similar across different ethnic groups in the Netherlands, and they're very similar across Black, Hispanic, and white families in the United States. So it looks like there is a general principle of how human children respond to these variations in parenting, irrespective of their ethnicity and color. Having said that, there's also evidence that being exposed to racism or ethnic prejudice makes it harder to be there for your children. You are confronting greater stresses. You are more likely to feel depression. You are more likely to be stressed out by a job that doesn't enhance your sense of self. You find it harder to be sensitive and responsive. So it's not that, so the developmental dynamics are the same, but the ecological conditions are different. So you could think about it this way. If mainstream white people grew up in a world or functioned in a world where being racist made whites the lower caste, to use Wilkinson's term, we'd expect to see lower levels of sensitive care, elevated rates of physical punishment, more depression and more stress, and therefore children paying a price for that. But the general way in which parenting and family processes affects children's well-being looks the same across many different ecological niches.
Right, that's a very humanist approach. Well, we are coming to the end of our session, so I'd like to give you each 30 to 45 seconds. Just to say that, again, human development is not ironclad. It's based on possibilities and probabilities. Just a final statement, what's the structure that helps create the conditions that are most helpful for children, given that you say there are many possible different factors? What are the structures that are most helpful as you close out?
To repeat some of what I've said, I say when families are economically successful, they don't have to be affluent, that the first order of their business is to invest in their offspring. So decent jobs, decent incomes, or other sources of income other than wages will set the fertile soil for supportive relationships. And that will be the fundamental nutrient to grow children. Take away those resources, stress families, make tomorrow more unpredictable, provide less control over the future. Those relational processes inside the household have a harder time sustaining themselves, and that places children often at risk.
And Dr. Moffitt?
I would say what I would like to see is to live in a country where there is a culture, a nationwide culture that appreciates the value of personal responsibility and expects that of people, and that everyone understands that that's a good thing to have, whether it's in parents or children. So often when I present my work, people jump to the conclusion that, well, you could identify the few children with really bad self-control and just give them ADHD drugs and that would sort it. But in fact, that whole kind of dimension that we observed, where anybody, even at the upper ends of self-control, could have improved a little bit and could have turned out better as a result, suggests to me that if we have a culture that expects everyone to develop self-control the way we expect everyone to learn to read if they can, that could be a real societal goal.
That is a powerful point to end on, the power of personal responsibility and agency and development of self-control. Dr. Belsky, Dr. Moffitt, thank you very much. And thank you again for Origins of You. We can't recommend it enough. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
It was great. My pleasure. Great fun.